Okay, welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill. And today we're stepping into the controversial again with the subject of killing the dog or fictional animal. And I know you're all gasping at this point, and I would like to disclaim right here both myself and Juliet are animal lovers, and we do not condone any of what we are going to talk about in real life. Okay, and our guest is Juliet Rose, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. So take it away.
Sure. Hey, everyone. And yes, I want to say I actually rescue dogs and I rescue animals, so I'm not a dog killer. But yeah, so you can find me at my website, authorjulietrose.com. I have 10 novels out currently, anything from contemporary fiction all the way to horror.
So, what fictional scenarios have you written that included the death of an animal, and why did you decide to kill off an animal in your books?
Yeah, so mine aren't gratuitous. If I do have to, it's part of the storyline. And without giving too much away, I did have to kill off a dog in one of my stories because of the type of story that it was. The dog was a rescue dog. It was not like when you rescue one, but a dog that rescues people. So in obviously a very tense line of work. And it lended to the story. It was an important kind of point to tell within the story. So yeah, it was tough though. It wasn't easy.
So you basically had a fallen hero story for your animal.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so did you debate on whether to include the animal death in your story or hesitate because of possible reader reaction?
I did. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely people out there that do not like that. And when I was writing it, I was actually trying to decide between a human character, and the dog. But the dog made more sense. I mean, it really was important to tell that part of the story and the reality of what search and rescue dogs deal with.
Okay, so what was the reader reaction to that?
So far I haven't had anything too direct to me. Like no one's ever said, I don't like that you did that. I've had a few people that I know that read it that were like, yeah, that part was really hard to read, but they understood why I wrote it, so like it's pretty devastating, but they also understood that it was important to that story. So I've never gotten anybody that was like just angry at me. I mean, I know there's a website like Does a Dog Die? I don't know if it's on there or not. But like it's something that I'm doing it. I knew that I might get some kind of pushback on it.
So did you include any trigger warnings for that particular scene, or did you just let it go like it is what it is?
Yeah, I had to let it go because it's a plot point, and
Okay.
it was like if I had said the trigger warning to it, and ironically, the story is called Trigger Point. If I had said the trigger warning to that specifically, I would have given away the plot point, which I'm doing now. I mean, if somebody reads the story, then they know. But the story is a really good story, and it's an important part of that story.
Okay, so when you were writing the animal death, and was it more emotional in some ways than other character deaths you've written?
Yeah. I think that, when you write a human character death, that can be devastating too. I've definitely cried when I've written those. But I think there's like an element of innocence that comes with an animal that like, when you're doing it, like the character, when you're doing a human character, you kind of justify their life and you can talk about those things. With a dog, you really can't. And so like, it's kind of really more final. It seems weird, like it's final, like when you do an animal death in a story. So it was definitely harder in that way.
That's an interesting point. I never thought about it like that because, I'm a hardcore horror writer, so apparently we don't cry over our deaths.
No, I definitely cry over deaths for sure.
I mean, I've talked to other horror writers. Like, I thought there was something weird with me when I started hearing all these, especially the fantasy writers saying they were getting so emotional. I'm going, I don't do that. But I've talked to
Yeah.
other horror writers, and no, they don't do that either.
Yeah.
I guess there's something wrong with all of us. Who knows? But anyway, so would you consider writing another animal death scene in future books?
If it made sense with the story, like I'm not gratuitous in it. I'm not doing it to kind of have a gory scene. I'm doing it because it's important to the story. So if I had a situation where it was important to the story, absolutely. I mean, I feel like we can't shy away as writers from things because some people don't like that, because we would shy away from everything if that's the case. We would never write horror. People hate horror, right? But like you can't let somebody else's feelings about that change how you write. So yeah, I think I definitely would.
Okay, so why do you think killing off an animal in fiction is so controversial?
Yeah. It's funny how like people will be like, I'd rather see a child die. I'm like, what? My son actually brought up a good point when we were talking about this podcast, and he said, because a lot of people don't have children, like they don't until they do, and so maybe they become more sensitive to it once they have children, but then that's not their children. We're like dogs, we tend to like universally love, like we all grow up with seeing dogs, loving the neighbors' dogs, their grandma's dogs. We tend to have this view of dogs as almost being like ours, even when they're not. And so I think for people, when you kill off even a fictional dog, in their mind to a degree it's their dog, and so they're offended by that.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. So, do you think reader reactions to animal deaths is disproportionate? Because, as you said, sometimes an animal death can provoke a stronger reaction than a child death in fiction.
That's a tough question. There are people that definitely just won't even read a book if they know that an animal dies, even if it's a justifiable death, like that an animal dies because whatever, line of duty or saving someone. There's still people that just won't even pick up a book if they know that, which is where I think that website came from, was like, I'm not even gonna read a book that has a dog that dies in it. And I'm sensitive to that. I rescue animals. I don't want to see gratuitous violence like on an animal, or like if I'm watching a movie and I know the dog's about to die, like I still look away because it's like I still don't want to see it. So I think there's that element of a familiarity with people with dogs, so like they get just immediately like, I can't handle it, I just don't want to see it, whatever. And to a degree I understand that, but I would hate to think that somebody didn't read a really good book because of a justifiable situation where an animal dies.
You think that's maybe partly why it strikes harder in, say, a book than a movie? Because in a movie you can look away. In a book, it's a lot harder to do that because, if you skip the passage, you might miss something.
Sure. Yeah, I think definitely because in a movie you can either fast forward through it or you can, but when you're reading a book, a lot of times
you can just close your eyes till the scene's over.
Right. In a book, one a lot of times surprises people. The other thing I think is, like, in a movie versus a book. In a movie, they're showing us this dog. This is the dog that's going to die. In a book, even though they may describe the dog, we're still creating it in our mind. So we're still maybe putting in our own animals, our own pets, any ideas into this animal. Oh, this reminds me of my dog, and then now he's dead. So like, I think it's harder for people to digest that. Where in a movie, like, it's just a dog that you see. And so it's not your dog. You're not putting your own kind of personal things into that character.
Yeah, because when you're imagining the dog, it's more your dog.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so, and do you think the readers have a harder time when it is a pet like a dog being killed, or as opposed to, say, a non-domesticated animal, say, like a Bambi sort of situation in a hunting scene?
Yeah, I think it depends on the reader, but I think most people are more comfortable with the death of something that's not a dog, like, or a cat. Like, they're more comfortable with the death of a bird or a deer or whatever that's kind of out there. Because in a way, society is we're a little more numb to that. Like, we're used to seeing hunting or hearing about people hunting, or maybe we are even like people that love dogs but they still hunt. Like, it's really kind of draws a line between what we consider family and what we consider out there. And I think that for people, I never hear people really complain about, a deer being shot unless something is being done torturously. Like, if someone's killing an animal and they're really going through the description of torturing an animal, it seems like no matter what, nobody wants to hear that. They don't want to hear about somebody torturing a deer or torturing a pig or whatever, but to kill those things, I think people are just used to, and they're fine with that. But a dog, they're not.
Yeah, because I know one of the books I read as a kid was Where the Red Fern Grows. And if you haven't read that book, there's a scene at the end that will break you if you love dogs.
Yeah.
But the dogs themselves are hunting dogs, so there's other animals being hunted in the book, and yet you don't hear a lot about those deaths.
Right.
So it's an interesting dichotomy, I think, in some cases.
It is. Yeah, we definitely as a society separate animals into kind of categories. This is food, this is sport, this is pet or family. We tend to have that mindset. And I think across the board, people do. Like, I'm vegetarian, so I don't eat meat. But I also, because of that reason, like, I love my animals, and like, I couldn't see the difference. Even as a child, I would say, well, it's the same thing. Like, it's still an animal that bleeds or suffers, And so I made that choice. But most people don't have that necessarily, that delineation of how they view animals. That's, this is family, this is food.
And on that note, do you think cats are more expendable than dogs when it comes to writing an animal death, especially in darker fiction? Because, I've noticed in horror movies, if there's an animal and it's more likely to be a cat that gets it
Right.
than
Yeah.
a dog. So do you think that in some ways cats are actually more expendable than dogs?
Yeah, I mean, the website is called Does the Dog Die, not Does the
Mm.
Cat Die? So obviously people feel more attached to the dog characters than they do to cats. And maybe that's a little bit of cat's aloofness. Like, like I have cats, I love cats, but I think that they are a little more like disconnected from humans. So I think for a lot of people, they're able to go, it's just a cat. Now, there's people that get equally upset because they're cat lovers, but I think across the board, you tend to see it more with dogs.
I mean, I don't hate dogs, but as a cat lover, I find that quite unfair. But
I do too, but it is how, if you look at, like you said, you see it in movies, you see it in books, it's definitely more common for the cat to be killed, and people put up much less of a stink about it.
yeah, so do you hear that, dog lovers who have trouble with killing off the dog? We don't want the cats killed either. Just
No.
say. Okay, so do you think writers should avoid writing an animal death scene? Or is it a case of never say never?
It's definitely a case of never say never, but I do think that when you're kind of getting into categories where maybe you're dealing with killing off animals or even children, kind of like that thing, you have to think about why you're doing it in the story. I've definitely read stuff where I felt like the author was being very gratuitous and it didn't lend to the story. And so it just made me uncomfortable and it didn't like give me anything for the rest of the story or for the plot points. So I feel like when we look at that, knowing that it is sensitive to people, we do need to think about, okay, I'm going to write this. Is it necessary to the story? Does it lend to whatever I'm trying to say? And in horror, it can be just that someone's horrible or that, whatever, it kind of leads up to that scene of like, well, someone killed the dog. Obviously they're coming after us. There's definitely kind of like that importance to it. So I think that you have to assess and say, this is really important. Can I do without it? If I can't, then do it. And sometimes it is very important. I mean, sometimes I said I couldn't have really done that story without that because it was really important to the point of the story. So like, if I hadn't done it, I still would have had the same story, but it would have lacked that kind of like layer that was important to tell.
So you're saying like animals should be considered as characters with their own agenda as well, because I mean, you shouldn't. We were talking about fridging in a past episode, so I would assume you would add animals to the fridging concept. Just don't kill them off just to make a character seem more vicious or more violent. Yeah. It's kind of like a lowest common denominator.
Yeah, I mean, they are a character. If you're adding an animal into your story, they are a character. They're depending on how much you put them in there. So if you have a dog and it's the family dog, even if it doesn't appear that much, it's the family dog. Like we know that it's the family's dog. We know the dog's important to him. We usually know the animal's name. So like clearly that animal is a character in that story. So if you're going to decide to kill that animal off, which is in my mind, it's fine. I know people don't like that, but it's like, it's part of storytelling is to sometimes get into the really uncomfortable stuff. Do it because it matters to the story. Say to yourself, it's important that I do this so the family knows that someone's been in their home or that someone's after them or that really nice neighbor's not such a nice guy. Have a reason to do it. So if someone is upset, the justification is that it was important to the story.
Yeah, it's the entire plot of John Wick, but
it is. I mean, I've never seen it, but my son's told me that he's like, just the dog does. I'm like, okay.
Yes, for anyone who does not want to see a dog get killed on film, do not go see John Wick. I'm just saying, although the dog is avenged, we will say that.
Well, that's
good. Very, very much so avenged. But anyway, so what advice would you give writers if they decide to include a scene where an animal dies?
Yeah, I guess kind of going back to that is like really kind of plot that out. Like think about the who, what, when, where, why of why you're doing it. So saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to kill off this animal. Why am I killing off this animal? Why is this important to the story? Who's doing it? How is it going to play into the rest of the story? Like you don't want to just kill off the dog and then it never kind of plays into the rest of the story because one, like you kind of like threw a hamburger in the trash, you killed it off for no reason, so like you want to make sure that like if you're doing it that it's important and that you follow through with that. You want to show, so you kill off the family's dog, let's say that, and it's a horror book. You want to show the family grieving and that's important to them so that it's important to the reader, because just gratuitous killing off animals, they found a dead dog, it not only is it it doesn't lend to the plot, but it kind of is a waste of time. Like if you're not really building that in to the rest of your story in some way, then why are you doing it?
Exactly. So, when writing an animal death scene, do you think it's advisable to leave any gory details to the reader's imagination, or should a writer put as much graphic detail in as they feel necessary?
Yeah, I think it depends on the story. Obviously, if it's a very kind of gory story anyway, has a lot of graphic stuff in it, I think having those graphic details probably fit within it. It wouldn't make sense to have this really gory book where like this murderer is going around and disemboweling people, and then he just stabs the dog once. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't match the pacing or the story. So like in that case, you would probably want to have it match. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but it does match the rest of the story. So if somebody's already reading the rest of that, that should be that much of a shock. But now, like if you're writing a story where, like I did, where it's not the super horror gory story, it's just a story, to go into like a lot of detail would be completely out of place for that story. So I think really looking at it matching the story that you're writing, but I think also looking at like not going too far, right? Like again, finding that balance of I'm going to tell this, I'm going to, it's important to the story, I'm going to have this dog be killed, and it's going to be gory because obviously this is a gory story. But don't go on for the sake of going on. Just tell that scene.
Yeah, so don't play it for shock value if it's not going to fit into the theme of the book.
Right.
Okay, so the next 3 questions are the questions I ask all the guests, and they're just for fun. So, do you enjoy killing off characters, or do you struggle with it, or does it depend on the story and the character?
I think both, because I think that like there's a point that like it's enjoyable because it helps build that plot out more, and like that's enjoyable, right? Like we want something that you're like, ooh, that's good because that'll help me build in or tie in this part of the story or bring this forward or show this character more under the microscope. Like if I have a character, and I do kill off a lot of characters, and just kind of do that in almost every book of mine. I think someone gets killed. It's important to the story, but I still struggle with it, especially if they've been in the story for a while. Like sometimes I have someone that dies in the beginning of the book. That's not as hard. Sometimes I have somebody that dies in the middle of the book. A lot harder. It's also like I've kind of gotten attached to them, and then I question myself. I mean, and I have at times actually been writing, and I was planning to kill off a character, but it was so far into the book that I actually didn't do it because by that point they had evolved out of my ability to kill them off. Or my ability to kill them off, where I just was like, I can't do it. Like I can't kill them off. They have too much to tell. So, I think struggling with it is natural if you've really built out this relatable character. And I think sometimes I kill off people that I don't care about because that's kind of just a plot point. Like I needed to kill them off for the story, but I never got attached to them, or maybe they weren't good to begin with. There was no redeeming kind of quality. Those I'm fine with.
Yes. Has there any character you've ever marked for death ever been saved for any reason?
Yeah. I had in my book Prick of the Needle, I was planning to kill off one of the main characters, and by the time I got to that point in the story, I couldn't do it. One, I felt like he had a lot more going, like he had a lot more to say and do. But 2, I felt like, because when I look at killing somebody off, I always say to myself, what will happen going forward if they're dead? And then I'll say, what will happen going forward if they're not dead? And what's going to be the better story? And in that case, it actually was a better story to keep him alive. But the whole time, when I got into writing the book from day one, I was going to kill him off at this point because I thought it was going to be really important to the story. But when I got to that point, it actually made more sense for the plot to keep him alive. And I did kill somebody else off in the story. But yeah, so.
Yeah. And on that note, have you ever done the opposite where you thought you were going to keep a character alive, but he ended up dead?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm trying to think if I had anybody that was initially going to keep alive. In the first story I wrote, I never intended to kill off one of the characters that I did kill off. I never thought, I kind of thought it was going to go a different way. But when the time came, it made the most sense to actually just kill him off. And that actually was good because not only did it lend to that story, it lended to a follow-up story that I did with one of the minor characters followed up in a different story. And that death helped that story form as well.
Okay, so what is the most creative or memorable death you've written for any character?
Ooh. The one I always kind of think about is the one in my book, Prick of the Needle. They're firefighters, they're wildland firefighters. And just describing the scene of how there's a firefighter and he basically, the ground crumbles underneath him and he falls down a cliff. And just describing that scene and kind of like what happens with that. And even initially I thought I didn't know if I was going to kill him off or he was just going to fall, but like it's just all of it coming together and then having to describe like the attempted rescue and everything, that really kind of took a mind of its own. And so that worked out really well for me and I did kill him off.
Okay, so what's the oddest or most notable thing that you researched related to writing a character death?
Sometimes I think people should never check my history. Because I write such varied things. I have looked up some crazy, crazy things. Even that death, I had to really look at like, what is it like to be a wildland firefighter? What are some of the risks? What is like the ground? What is the ground like at this time of year? Why would this happen? How would this happen? I definitely did those, but I do, all of the deaths are usually weird. Like one of my deaths was involving ketamine. So I had to do so much research on ketamine and how that would lead to basically a death and things like that. So I feel like every time I'm doing research, someone's going to be like, what is going on here? And like I said, sometimes they're fun. I had a character die in a book where he was the bad guy. He was not a good person. And, he crossed the wrong people and they found them rolled up in a carpet outside of town. So like, sometimes it's really satisfying.
Okay, so did you ever have to change a manner of death for any because of your research?
Oh yeah, I think sometimes you have an idea in your head of like, oh, this is how they're going to die, and then when you do the research, you go, well, that's not even really feasible.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to even with the ketamine, it's not likely for someone to really like OD directly on ketamine unless it's like a super large amount. So I had to bring in another factor because this is a person that was recreationally using it, not somebody that was trying to kill themselves with it. So I had to add in a secondary factor to it to kill my character off.
Yeah, I once researched cutting out a tongue and found out it would actually kill someone. So I had to not do it to the character I wanted it done to because he had to survive. This is in history, by the way. I mean, nowadays you could probably someone would probably survive getting their tongue cut out.
Right.
Because you get them to the hospital in time. But back in the Renaissance era, it wouldn't happen. So
wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, they bleed. Yeah, tongues apparently bleed a lot.
I can say I've definitely cut my tongue and it bleeds like crazy. So yeah.
Yeah. So if you cut it out, you'd cut enough veins that you would bleed quite a bit. So
wow.
I did not know
Good
that.
to know.
Now I do.
Learn something new every day.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up here, and I'll let you tell everyone where they can find you and your books.
Sure. So again, I have my website, authorjulietrose.com. I also publish. So we have a publisher's website, which is abovetheraincollective.com. We just had an anthology come out with 14 creatives in that.
So, and that's it for this episode. And thank you all for tuning in, and bye for now.
I will pay, blaming myself all night.